Western science generally gives us two ways to think about the Yeti. Either it's a campfire story cooked up to entertain tourists, or it's simply an unclassified primate hiding out in the high altitudes. But those neat categories break down when you look at the volume of material left behind. We have enormous, deeply embedded footprints, mummified relics held in monasteries, and detailed accounts from some of the most capable climbers on Earth. The modern scientific method demands a specimen. It wants DNA in a sterile tube and an unbroken chain of custody. When an anomaly doesn't yield to those specific metrics, the system attempts to force the data into a shape that fits a standard biological model. That leaves us in a strange vacuum. Researchers can't produce a body to prove the creature exists, but the physical remnants are entirely too substantial to dismiss. Our inability to classify the Yeti indicates that the standard biological framework is insufficient for the physical evidence we actually have. Take the famous footprint photographs captured in 1951. Eric Shipton was a rigorously observant British mountaineer, leading an Everest reconnaissance expedition. He knew exactly what belonged in those mountains and what did not. When he returned with photos of massive tracks, skeptics immediately applied a standard glaciological explanation. They argued that a smaller animal made a normal-sized track, and the heat of the sun melted the snow, expanding the print until it appeared monstrous. This diagram shows the exact surface conditions on the Menlung Glacier that day. Shipton's tracks were left in a thin layer of crystalline snow, lying directly on top of solid, frozen ice. Because there was no deep, soft snowfield to warp, significant thermal distortion was physically impossible. Those tracks really were 13 inches long, and the wide toe alignment matched a bipedal primate, not a cat or a bear. The tracks are clear and verifiable. They resist any standard explanation zoology tries to offer. Even for the most elite human observers, standard biological categories fail. Reinhold Messner climbed all 14 of the world's highest peaks without supplemental oxygen. In 1986, he watched a bipedal, hair-covered creature walk out of the trees and look directly at him. Messner spent the next 10 years trying to logically classify his encounter. He eventually theorized he had crossed paths with a rare, highly elusive variation of the Himalayan brown bear. But his own field notes contradict that conclusion. Bears occasionally rear up on their hind legs when startled, but Messner noted this creature moved fluidly on two legs. It communicated with a sharp whistle and appeared to make calculated, deliberate choices about its movements. Messner ultimately concluded that his bear hypothesis failed to account for the reality of the encounter. He walked away convinced the creature occupied a category entirely distinct from known Himalayan wildlife. In 2014, genetics seemed to finally offer a definitive answer. An Oxford University study sequenced hair samples and generated massive global headlines, declaring the Yeti was simply an ancient Paleolithic polar bear. But peer review later exposed a schoolboy error. The database file the Oxford team used for comparison was mislabeled. The genetic sequence swaps from an ancient polar bear to a modern Alaskan bear. Furthermore, the researchers only sequenced a tiny fragment of mitochondrial RNA. That specific genetic snippet was far too short and lacked the resolution required to actually determine a distinct species. We see this pattern repeatedly. Other physical relics, like the mummified hand kept at the Pengboche Monastery, have been rendered useless by contaminated chains of custody and human interference. The 2014 study failed to debunk the Yeti. Instead, it served as a case study in how sloppy methodology can lead to premature conclusions. While Western researchers scramble to fit the evidence into a laboratory setting, the indigenous populations of the Himalayas have quietly maintained a functional understanding of these creatures for centuries. Sherpa and Tibetan traditions do not treat the Yeti as a mystery. Crucially, they have never claimed it is a misidentified bear or a known animal. This chart illustrates their highly specific taxonomy. They distinguish between three distinct types based on altitude and behavior: the 15-foot Nyalmo, the 8-foot Chuti, and the smaller Rangimbombo. This detailed categorization accounts for the wildly varying footprint sizes and physical descriptions that Western scientists have spent decades fighting over. But the locals add a distinction that Western observers constantly dismiss. They state that the Yeti exists in two registers at once. It is a physical being, but it also occupies the spiritual dimension of the high mountains. This dual nature explains the conflicting reports. It accounts for how a creature can leave deep tracks in the ice and emit a foul stench, yet simultaneously possess the ability to vanish in open terrain without a trace. Modern biology rejects this. It requires a physical specimen to admit that something is real. The indigenous framework, however, relies on continuous, experiential knowledge of the landscape. The phenomenon eludes us because we demand a single-dimensional answer for a multidimensional reality. Himalayan traditions have offered a framework for centuries that accounts for the very anomalies that baffle modern science.